Okay, this is a report from Morgan Stanley that advises people on investment, and now they are paying more and more attention to compliance requirements on climate risks and sustainability interests by corporations, investing in nature, and so on. So this has some interesting points that I just wanted to report. This says sustainability and climate trends to watch in 2024. So that's the Morgan Stanley's ESG research part. And it says clarity drives action. Who can disagree with that? I will be very brief. So it looks at a few things. So we'll read kind of the headline of each of these sections so you will know what they are. Starting with extreme weather hits home and work. We know, as a climate scientist, I report a lot on extreme weather and so on, but this is from a financial perspective. Heat domes, atmospheric rivers, orange skies, and unbreathable air. Shockingly unprecedented climate disasters and increasingly severe weather have peppered the globe in the last few years, no longer an abstract future concern. Physical climate impacts are quite literally hitting home and work. So labor loss, health impacts, morbidities, and so on. For millions of people as well as the companies that rely on them, these are critical in terms of work and just impacts on GDPs, in net profits, etc. Physical climate impacts and work. I don't know, I'm stumbling it. I just wanted to say the two things again. As the economic effects ripple outward with social and structural consequences yet to be fully understood, adaptation is becoming a must. That's a finance company saying it, so that's really important. As we move through 2024, we may see more examples of how extreme weather is affecting where and how people live and work, and what that means for companies that serve and employ them. So if a company is into infrastructure, then it has to clearly worry about extreme weather. Homeowners feel the pinch. So in 2023, major insurers retreated from Florida and California's homeowner insurance markets. As a result, individual households may find themselves having to weather unexpected costs to protect their homes. Policy efforts could help plug some gaps, but there may be longer-term implications for regional economic health and labor availability even. So essentially, whenever governments try to tell people that climate is changing, sea level is rising, you need to move away from the coast, people may not care, and developers may say, don't worry, it's not here yet, or it won't be here for another 30 years or whatever. But insurance companies try to stay ahead because they have to pay when something goes wrong because of flooding and cyclones and so on. So they begin to influence the decisions very heavily by simply raising premiums to unreasonable levels or not offering coverage at all. If they don't underwrite risk, then you're not going to go live there, even though there is always the moral hazard that if you get insurance, you will increase your exposure to risk because you think, oh, I'm covered anyways, right? Who's minding the shop? Spotlight on corporate oversight. From climate change to geopolitics to workers who stubbornly refuse to return to the office, risks and opportunities are multiplying and amplifying the challenges involved in running a company. A range of scandals has sharpened the regulatory gaze on banks, risk expertise, and auditors, because they are throwing money at bad projects that are at high risk. CEOs are turning over faster, and boards are competing for expertise on unfamiliar topics. Corporate governance is changing as a result. If oversight is a spotlight in 2024, it might be one with some fresh bulbs. For investors, this raises some serious questions. Who exactly is minding the shop, and do they have what it takes to do the job well in terms of protecting your investments and actually making money, right? Auditing the auditors. One of the most dramatic changes we have observed over the last year has been in the behavior of audit regulators, which is sparkling fresh attention to audit practices, board oversight, and the quality of auditors themselves. Thirdly, managing AI. The basics still matter. Generative AI has grabbed the lever of technological change and looks poised to disrupt sectors from finance to healthcare. Policymakers, academics, and industry leaders are actively debating how best to realize the upside potential while reining in the possibility of disaster. And while some risks do look monumental, others are more mundane and more within the company's direct control. So as the scramble ensues and AI rollouts are urgently scheduled, investors might well be thinking about guardrails. What are companies' current approaches to risk management, regulatory compliance, privacy and talent management, and how might they build on those existing best practices to counter new risks? Data privacy. As regulators race to catch up to the tech, companies must catch up to the regulators. To the regulations. Generative AI models and applications are opening up new ways in which consumers' personal data can be used, hacked, sold, trained on massive datasets. Generative AI applications like search or personal assistance tools may harvest behavior data without clear consent, for example, and then use it to further train the models, while image rendering apps may collect users' biometric data without stating any purpose other than completing the service. Policymakers have begun moving to protect their citizens' privacy rights in response. The EU's General Data Protection Regulation has centered around user rights, consent, and secondary purposes, as well as a privacy by design principle in product development, but that's evolving. Cautionary voices from the AI developers community have recommended self-governing. Obviously, US and Europe are very different in the way they treat people versus corporations. One may prefer to focus more on individuals and their privacies. Other may favor corporations and their abilities to gather data and use them in ways that are not fully consented to by the users. Fourth one, supply chain due to diligence becomes the law as regulators target action alongside disclosure. Complex global supply chains are a fact of modern day business. When constructed well, these chains offer specialization, efficiency, and competitive advantage, but they are not without risk, from key material shortages to quality assurance failures. Okay, so that's supply chain due diligence. A typhoon in Philippines will hammer supply chain of coconut products across the world and will have explicit impacts on many GDP related activities. Policymakers are coming at the issue from different angles, both environmental and social. In an example of the first EU regulation focused on preserving nature and biodiversity, will soon come into effect and require companies to prove that products sold in the EU don't contain commodities produced in recently deforested land. This is controversial. They also want border carbon tax and so on. So these things are evolving, but in all cases, key questions for companies and investors are alike: who's ready to act, and how are they going to solve the traceability problem? If you may get something across the border and it may claim that it's not from recently deforested land, but how do you trace it back to the origin? Fifth one, regulation drives more corporate climate disclosures, but mind the fine print. The next few years could see a game-changing volume of corporate climate disclosures become available to global investors. There's a regulatory drive behind mandatory reporting, and that is substantial. Disclosure regulations, the ISSB, is coming soon to a market near you. Following the launch of the International Sustainability Standards Board's disclosure to standards in mid-2023. So there is an International Sustainability Standards Board, and it put out standards. A number of jurisdictions have announced plans to implement ISSB aligned reporting rules within their local regulatory frameworks over the coming year or so. Some jurisdictions have taken the lead and have proposed detailed ISSP-aligned disclosure requirements. In some cases, these build on existing disclosure regulations based on the recommendations by the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures (TCFD). The TCFD was officially incorporated into ISSB in 2023. So this is an important point about scope 1 to 3, the rise of orphaned emissions. Reading the fine print of sustainability report, companies employ several methods to reduce reported emissions, and there is a graph shown in the report that you can look up on reported versus actual emissions. Excluding the emissions of assets or subsidiaries that are not wholly operated by the company, deconsolidating emissions of pollutive assets before transferring them into new JV or spin-off, while continuing to incorporate their share of net income. So income is shown one way, emissions are shown in another way. Excluding emissions from business units that are planned for sale, switching from location-based to market-based emissions accounting. Structuring finance as corporate debt issued by a special purpose vehicle with a lower reported emissions footprint rather than linked to specific fossil fuel projects. Some technical details there, technical words, but let's keep moving on. The Sustainable Finance Disclosure Regulation, or SFDR's unintended consequences for emerging markets. To meet non-zero ambitions by 2050, we need $5 trillion in global investments every year between now and 2030, and 40% of that needs to go to emerging markets. But with the first major round of reporting in the books in 2023, it's become apparent that efforts to direct this capital might bump into an unexpected and unintended obstacle in the form of EU's Sustainable Finance Disclosure Regulation. In a nutshell, there just aren't that many emerging market firms that meet the SFDR's high bar for a sustainable investment. How will emerging market investors approach this dilemma, and will regulators address any unintended restrictions in forthcoming legislative reviews? Okay, so it's not as easy as PAIs. When we looked at PAIs, or Principal Adverse Impact Indicators, that had good data availability and were suited for quantitative thresholds, we saw key implications for both emerging and developed market issuers. Okay, so this is obviously tricky in terms of implementation of this Sustainability Finance Disclosure Regulation compliance. Private debt takes a seat at the climate transition table. So now it's become very clear that climate transition cannot be ignored in terms of sustainability transitions from every aspect, from emissions to risk exposures reporting to sustainability finance disclosures and so on and so forth. So unlisted assets have been have seen staggering growth and now account for more than 25% of major asset owners' portfolios. Private market participants have an important role to play in the transition to a net zero world by channeling capital towards less emissions intensive investments and green solutions. There is increasing visibility into private assets' carbon intensity. So until recently, the general lack of transparency in the private markets meant that measuring assets' carbon intensity was intensely difficult. Now it's starting to get easier. While reported data is still quite scarce, estimates are becoming more available. So this is becoming more and more important. So there are the regulatory requirements, reporting, compliance, and then there is the need to show themselves as green and sustainable and so on, with the bottom-up pressure from customers, shareholders, and so on. Better data is of course good for better risk assessment, and data collected is going to become more and more important. Just to read the top point, transition risk is multifaceted and may affect different assets differently depending on how it plays out. As but one example, we estimated the impact of a hypothetical global carbon price floor of $75 per ton of carbon CO2 equivalent on EBITDA margins of the underlying private portfolio companies across different forms of private debt. I won't read the details here, but EBITDA, you know, is earnings before interest, taxes, depreciation, and amortization, basically net income. Investing in nature is becoming very important for shareholders, investors, and so on. And there is a nice figure that we can look at in the report. Measuring to manage or managing to measure. So investors may increasingly see the links between biodiversity loss and financial risk, both specific and systematic, but understanding how investee companies contribute to the problem remains a challenge. Good news is that there are signs of progress. So people want to make sure that their investments are not affected by the biodiversity caused by their investment. So making money was one single tunnel vision for the investors and the shareholders, but now everybody wants to see if their returns themselves are being affected by not worrying about nature, biodiversity, sustainability, and so on. The re-emergence of debt for nature swaps. This is another point. The evident investor interest in supporting nature-based solutions suggests the possibility of growing appetite for investment in nature-based or nature-oriented assets. Green bonds and other tools exist. I won't go into the details, but you see that as an important item. Investments in nature via voluntary carbon markets. So there is no way of getting out of it. As of June 2023, there were over 850 registered active nature-based projects in the voluntary carbon market, focusing on the protection and enhancement of natural carbon stocks in forests, farmlands, and coastal ecosystems. Another 2,100 projects were already in development, creating a combined project area the equivalent size of Colombia. So that's kind of a brief run through the whole thing. I've left some empty slides there because when I'm preparing these slides, I'm not always aware of how many slides will the podcast end up being. So anyways, this is about 18 minutes long and you get the point. I just wanted to give you a sense that it's not just climate scientists shouting about climate action, mitigation, adaptation, and sustainability, and so on. The actual markets, investors, and regulators and governments are taking note of the fact that we simply cannot go on with business as usual in investing and making money and giving loans. Insurance companies are especially ahead of the curve in making sure that they are not providing risk underwriting for people who are going and building in very high climate risk zones. That's one lever which will work very well because insurance companies do their own modeling of risks, own modeling of hurricane seasons, impacts, and so on. So they will really hammer bottom up, or maybe, yeah, that's a bottom up pressure, let's say, on not giving insurance for living in high risk areas. And banks are now expected to report risks. The Federal Reserve and the European Union, the Network for Greening the Finance System, NGFS, and all are translating the climate scenarios to financial scenarios, and banks have to run their portfolios through the climate risks as coming through the finance scenarios to say how vulnerable their investments are. So it's a good direction, and this report basically wanted to look at the 2024 trends going in the sustainability direction. There are many details in the report that I skipped that you definitely want to go and read if this is of interest to you. I just made some few main points. Okay, so I'm going to leave it here. We'll come back and look at the next topic, which will be no, I'm in the wrong place. I just want to say what it is because I myself am always curious. So AI for medium range forecasting, which I have already done. We already actually have a podcast on how AI is being used for various predictions, but maybe I'll come back and look at AI/ML for Earth system science, not so much for predictions. AI is here and it's going to be part of climate predictions and climate science, because you can use AI to improve the models as well. So we'll come back and see that topic in the next podcast. Okay, see you.